civilian society, and that's something that's worth talking about, and also a reason why I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here with you today. We all trust that our military is one that can do the very rough work that is necessary to protect our country, protect our values, protect our freedoms, and yet in the process not become evil by doing that rough work and not become a threat to the very republic that we serve. And I think that as we have a talk like this, we must begin by recognizing just how lucky we are. There are very few nations in the world that have militaries that are strong, and we are very strong as a military. We truly are respected, trusted, and occasionally rightly feared around the world. But very few countries have a military that is that strong, that has not at some point been a threat to their own civilian society or to their own government. And yet we have a military, we enjoy a military that is firmly committed to civilian control. And I think in a time when so many people find reasons to be distressed, to be dissatisfied with things going on in our country for economic reasons, political reasons, social reasons, one area where we are very fortunate is most Americans of all walks of life, most of them have an admiration for the military, for your military, that goes far beyond other nations. I've commanded as many as 70 nations officers, for example, at Central Command down in Florida. And these officers come from all around the world, from Asia, from Middle East, from Europe, from Latin America, all part of Central Command because of the wars that we've been engaged in the Middle East. And they uniformly would tell me that they get treated better wearing their uniform out in town in Florida than they do in their home countries, including European nations. Something that you and I just take for granted, that there would be a respect here. And after the Vietnam War, a lesson that was brought home to us when we didn't maintain that respect. So we live in a land where the military is largely admired, and it's probably also because we're filled by all volunteers today. Very high-spirited young volunteers who look beyond the hot political rhetoric swirling around these poorly explained wars, and they still rally to the colors. They don't let it turn them off, and they really are at times our better angels as they protect our country overseas. And since we've never been a threat to our elected form of government, you have to say, what does that mean? And it really means that our military is obedient to the Constitution, it is obedient to the elected commander-in-chief, and it's obedient to even putting its lives on the line with a blank check payable to the American people with their very lives to protect what we hold dear. I would just tell you, too, that for the last half of my career, the last 20 years since the Berlin Wall came down, for the first time in our nation's history, we maintained a large standing army. Now, we sensed there was trouble in the world, but it was much harder to identify. It wasn't Hitler's fascism, it wasn't communism, yet we maintained that larger military. And every year for the last 6 years, actually longer than that, but in my last 6 years as a NATO Supreme Allied Commander, Commander of U.S. Joint Forces Command, Commander of U.S. Central Command, I would have to go up and testify on Capitol Hill. And I absolutely enjoyed those opportunities, just like here, because they are good people on Capitol Hill trying to do good work. But when you go in front of the House Armed Services Committee, just not a very subtle reminder, a bronze plaque faces you as you sit at the table, and you've seen us testifying, the cameras on us. What we're looking at the ranks of all the congressmen, is this plaque right in front of us with a quote from the Constitution. And it says that the U.S. Congress is responsible under our Constitution for raising armies and sustaining navies. A reminder who actually owns your military are the people you vote in from your districts and your states. It's an interesting point because some people can think only the commander-in-chief has anything to do with the military. It's not the case. You actually have a voice in how your military is run. And that's also a critical reason why we need to get out and talk with you, because as our military shrinks in size and fewer people have military background, we can really have a gulf develop in front of our military, a gulf between it and the people it serves. You can hear the echo of our founding fathers when you read that quote, when you go up to testify. And it was interesting that for many, many years, perhaps not this year for the first time ever that I know of, my European counterparts went up to testify in front of their parliaments, and the political parties took turns trying to see who could reduce their military the most. Whereas I, for many years, would go up and testify, and the U.S. Congress, during the President Bush years, the Democrats would beat me up about the war. During the Obama years, the Republicans would beat me up about the war. But at the end, both of them would say, General, what can we do for your troops? Very, very interesting. What can we do for your troops? In other words, our Republican and Democrat Party, for most of my career, nearly all of my career, actually put their commitment to helping us, unlike what my European counterparts faced in their countries. And that again talks about very healthy civil-military relations. That is somewhat going away right now, frankly, with some of the very right-wing Republicans and some of the very left-wing Democrats actually joining in thinking we need to reduce the military more. Today we have a significantly reduced military, smaller than World War II or the Cold War. And you can say, but wait a minute, it's still a very large military. It is until you look at the size of the globe and what we expect from them. No other military in the world is expected to lead all around the world, because the time when you were born into America, it's a time when we are at that level of trust and power in the world. It's an all-volunteer military that has grown more remote, I think, partly because we're smaller, partly because we have fewer outposts, fewer forts, fewer bases. So you don't have as many people seeing military folks going to work in their towns. Many of those bases, for example, Fort Ord, California, many people serve there. There is no more Fort Ord, California. And this has happened all across our country. I think, too, that the values that are needed to prevail on the battlefield are thus less understood because the country is more remote from those who actually have a connection to the battlefield. The situation has led to some concerns that while the quality of our military is certainly very, very high, we have that gap that's growing. And yet we look at violent jihadists in the world, we look at Russia's bullying last couple of weeks in Crimea, we look at the repressive and bellicose regimes in Syria and Iran, in North Korea, and we do sense that we have got to maintain a military, a capable military, and more importantly, we have got to maintain a linkage to other nations in the world whose values also grew out of the Enlightenment if we want to pass on these freedoms that we got to the next generation. And so we organize in groups like NATO or like in Afghanistan right now, where NATO is the primary organization fighting there. In fact, there are 50 nations fighting together alongside us in Afghanistan, the largest wartime coalition in modern history, something you wouldn't know if you read only the American newspapers. 3 of those nations, by the way, our neighbor to the north, Canada, Estonia, and the Netherlands, have lost more lads per capita than we have in the war in Afghanistan. It's a reminder that other nations are with us because they believe in us. My command post in Iraq was guarded by Tongan Marines. Marines from that little tiny island, beautiful little heaven on earth down there in the South Pacific. And I asked him once, I said, why are you here? And I said, we're here because we have an obligation. America helped us. We're going to help America. It was very simple. It was not deep political, geopolitical discussions about it. We were their friends. We needed help. They were there. And I breathed a sigh of relief every time my vehicle wheeled back inside the barbed wire machine guns that they manned there. Diplomacy in this imperfect world, we know it requires a capable military, and yet we see the nation reversing its large standing army as we speak right now. It's going down significantly. We in the Marine Corps thought when the U.S. Army got below 525,000, we would have to change our strategy, reduce our strategy. We have not reduced our strategy, and yet the Army is tens of thousands below that and going down even further, which means there's more risk. It also means for you, ladies and gentlemen, as you read the newspapers and listen to the news, you'll see more and more of a naval strategy as America tries to reassure our friends using our ship port visits and our Navy fleet units at sea with the embarked Marines and SEALs on board. I would also tell you that civil-military relations, the heart of what we're going to talk about here today, are not resolved to everyone's satisfaction, and to pretend that they are would be patronizing, and I don't patronize my fellow citizens. I think that we're developing somewhat of a military caste. You would be surprised to go in and talk to the ranks of young officers, of young troops today, and find how many of them have a brother or a father, a mother that served in the military. As a narrower and narrower cut of our society seems to feel the obligation to sign on. And so that means there's a much smaller percentage of our families in the country that when they see a crisis developing and they hear there's deployment orders going to these ships, to these aircraft, to these infantry units, there's fewer and fewer who truly have a personal connection and little catch in their throat as they watch the news unfolding as a crisis develops. I mean, right now there's a U.S. Navy destroyer on its way into the Black Sea to send a note of reassurance. You can imagine what the families are thinking as those sailors sail through the Bosphorus and head on up into the Black Sea from the Mediterranean fleet. I just bring this up because it all kind of brings together a contrast between the attitudes and values held by many in our society and those that are needed for survival and victory on the battlefield. And that's something we have to talk about, because at a time when the enemy is opening apocalyptically who they can target, women, children, that sort of thing, we're actually narrowing what we believe is a legitimate target, and our sensitivity for collateral damage is further narrowed. I would just call it that target set. And what I think has failed to be brought up in today's discussions in Washington, D.C., as they talk about various social issues they want to impart on the U.S. military, is that a progressive America, a free America, a liberal, in the classical liberal sense of a democracy set up for tolerance and that sort of thing, it may need a military with quaint or old-fashioned values to protect it, because those are the values that allow you to survive and prevail on the battlefield. You know, as I went up higher in rank and I stuck around longer, they kept promoting me, which was much a surprise to me as it would have been around. That's one of the things I said. I got engaged in what we call the national and the international level discussions. And those are discussions usually between senior military and civilian leaders, elected leaders. And at Central Command for the Middle East, my job was to present the President, Secretary of Defense, with military options. It was to keep the sea lanes open for the transit of oil for the world's economy. And certainly it was to keep our allies reassured and, frankly, our adversaries concerned that it was going to be a very, very bad day. It would be their longest day and their worst day if they decided to take us on. And I was also, if I was to sum up what my real job was out there, ladies and gentlemen, it was to try to keep the peace, or what passes for peace in the Middle East at times, for one more year, one more month, one more week, one more day, or one more hour to allow the diplomats to try to work their magic and prevent another catastrophic war out in that area. But principally, I was there to present military options and orchestrate our military activities, reassuring our friends and tempering our adversaries' designs and their behavior. And people sometimes wonder, well, is the military really trying to keep the peace, or is it really just waiting for the war to start, then it goes to work? Let me give you just a very short example that I think most of you can reflect back on. Do you recall about 2 years ago when everybody in Tehran, Iran, was talking about we're going to mine the Straits of Hormuz, we're going to put mines in, we can stop the flow of oil. They kept talking about mining the straits, mining the waters. And I was flying back on my plane one night, having met with some of the leaders out there, including Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, the wonderful Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates, a country that the U.S. military refers to as Little Sparta, the way they always stand by us in every scrape we get into. And he said this strait is so important for the world's economy that the security of it is an international responsibility. So I was sitting there in the back of my plane thinking about it, wondering how do we keep some nutcase there in the Iranian Navy from dumping mines in the water. Now we've got a war on our hands. Now we've got to do something. And I figured we'd do an international mine clearing exercise. And by doing that, we sent out the word that the U.S. Navy, Fifth Fleet, the fleet that was under my command, I had Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Special Forces, plus a lot of foreign forces, that we would hold a mine clearing exercise. It was an anti-mine, not an anti-Iran exercise, of course not. Because only a nation that would put mines in the water, I would tell the press, has to be concerned about this. I'm sure Iran wouldn't do such a thing. So I thought we'd get about a half dozen nations, France, Britain, our usual allies, that sort of thing. I knew some of them that would be there because we just been told that the Iranians said you can't put an aircraft carrier through the international waters. So 48 hours later, I sent an aircraft carrier strike force. And the lead ship was a French corvette. The next ship was a United Kingdom British destroyer, then a U.S. destroyer, then our carrier, then our cruiser. And by the way, the Iranians were very professional, polite, and detailed. So I thought we'd get a half dozen nations for my mine clearing exercise. In fact, we've got 29, ladies and gentlemen, 29 nations. The next year, by the way, we've got 35. This year, we'll have 40. We had Djibouti from Africa, Canada, Estonia, Germany, France, Britain, Japan, Singapore. I could go on and on. 29 nations out there, and the Iranians all of a sudden realized, we're actually creating a worldwide coalition. We had every continent except Antarctica, and I was looking for a penguin. It's been fun, a naval diver. But my point is, by doing this, they all of a sudden just toned down their rhetoric. Their young Navy guys realized this probably got very direct word, do not do this anymore. And we bought time for Secretary Clinton and the diplomats to further enhance those economic sanctions that have driven Iran to the negotiating table on their nuclear program. So that's how your military, the only military that could have done that, the only Navy that could have done that was the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the U.S. Navy, because we're the only ones trusted by all of them and with the capability to do so. So when I would give military advice in Washington, D.C., and to the Secretary and the President, Secretary of Defense and President, I was simply carrying out my end of the responsibility that you assigned me, you the American people did, and I expected to be heard. I had a responsibility to be heard. If we're going to go do this, then the military needs to speak up and give good advice. I did not expect to be obeyed. You elected the Commander-in-Chief. That's who gets obeyed. And his portfolio is broader than mine. Mine is military. It's inside his portfolio as Commander-in-Chief. But he also has the economy, he has diplomacy, he has all these other things he's responsible for. And so what I needed in return from the political level was an understanding of the political instinct. What did they want me to accomplish? And let me be very blunt here. I did not, I've already led once 25,000 sailors and Marines. In an attack into Iraq, we pulled down a statue in Baghdad, and we looked around and said, now what do we do? And that's not the right thing to do. And the President Emeritus of Dartmouth University, Jim Wright, a Korean War veteran of the Chosen Reservoir Campaign, he has written an article in last summer's Atlantic Monthly saying, what did we learn from the Korean War about having murky political end states? We get into these wars we don't know how to end. Some familiar veterans, Korea, Vietnam, I can go on. So you have to have a political end state. That's what I insisted on as a military commander from the politicians, because if you don't know what they want, you don't know where they want to go, any road will get you there. And we end up in these wars that we can't even go in front of you, the American people, and keep your support on it, and keep your understanding of it, because we can't articulate it ourselves. And so in giving this advice, I would just tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that your military leaders, we try to avoid acrimony and adversarial relationships. We don't want to create adversarial relationships between people, because what gets things really accomplished at the highest levels are personal relations, no matter what you see on organizational charts. Sometimes there's a lot of passion in those discussions because the issues are very, very serious. We all understand that. But there is also an elephant in the living room that some of the people with my color hair will recall. Some most of you, unfortunately, are too young, but it's still something we have to deal with. And that elephant living room is during the Vietnam War days, and I came into the Marine Corps in 1969. The veterans know what that means. There was a divorce between liberalism in the United States and patriotism, and it has not been fully healed among some people my age. It will not come up usually verbally, but it exists. And I would just tell you, in that case, there can be the appearance of consultation between military and civilian, but not the reality. In other words, you're sitting in the same room and you're talking. You're not really listening. You know what I'm driving at here. And that can be one of the vestiges of a very difficult period in the recent history of the United States. Key to overcoming this, by the way, is an absolutely apolitical, non-political officer corps. I have many friends at my rank who will vote for governor and mayor, they'll vote for city board, school board, and they'll vote for senator and congressman, and will not vote for president. So on the day after the election, they don't feel like their guy won or lost. They actually work to keep themselves divorced emotionally from whoever the American people vote in as commander-in-chief. And they do that because what we have to know is that these officers are not Republican or Democrat. Their best military advice is military advice alone. I don't get into politics. I was a naval officer for 40-odd years, and it's still becoming difficult for me, although I work at Stanford University, and there it's a little more difficult to stay apolitical when all these discussions are going on. But if the government of the people and by the people and for the people is to serve in the manner I think that our founding fathers set out, it's absolutely critical. And we have to have this honest and respectful dialogue, and we've got to hold the wolves at bay. And let me be very blunt, but I told the young soldiers, sailors, airmen, Coast Guard, and Marines, my last months on active duty, was you're going to have to buy time for our country until it can find political unity again, until it can get back on a fiscally sustainable path so we don't enslave our young people today to a legacy of paying constantly on a debt that has grown so big. And our enemies are watching, they are calculating. As our military gets smaller, they are going to have to be able to fight to buy time until our country, which is going to get tested, can get its act back together one more time. And we can get back to reassuring those countries around the world that have stood by us in tough times, 50 alone in Afghanistan, and making certain they know that we'll stand by them in their time of need. So those healthy civil-military relations today are critical. We need to pass them on to the next generation of Americans. We have no room for egos and people saying it's my way or the highway. It's people who've got to work together on this. And I just tell you that it's something I was happy to be assigned as my lesson plan. Professor Genie, thank you. Because one thing I learned over those 40-odd years, the American military will put its lives on the line, no problem. I never doubted when I pointed to the land and pointed that they would go. No matter what it was, they would go. But at the same time, I learned that the American military does not care more about the survival and the protection of this country than the American people. Because we are part of the American people, we get our money from the American people, we get our direction from them, that it takes all of us working together if we're going to keep this experiment that you and I call America alive and pass it on to the young people in this room and on this campus. So let me stop there. I want to leave enough time for questions. Dean, I thought that's the best way to do it. And if you're okay with that, we'll switch over. And we look for two qualities in our petty officers and NCOs and Fleet Marine Force. We look for initiative and aggressiveness. So who has the initiative and aggressiveness? Just throw the first in. And if you want to have a good argument, have at it. I enjoy listening to you.
Yes, sir. I'd like to preface my question with a signature of gratitude, I guess. It's the only chance I'm going to have in my lifetime to do it. After a couple of fat, overweight Navy docs told me that I was medically unqualified to lead my men that worked instead of arms, because I knew they'd be under your care. And another staff sergeant who didn't have the fear to tell the captain he was calling fire on the spot, even though he was an NJP player for him. Those men went through Hotel Creek, Fallujah 1, Fallujah 2, Helmand, and Sangin Province, Afghanistan, and only 2 of them are not with their families right now, and I thank you for that, sir. With General Amos's reawakening project, a lot of those men now that have been bloodied in that battle are being forced out of the Marine Corps, and I believe we're setting up a death trap for the young men coming up because of the lack of leadership of men who have been bloodied in battle. As you've talked to the importance of the veterans from Vietnam for yourself as well. Can you address that reawakening project and the shortening of the Marine Corps?
Yeah, I sure can. What it is, it has to do with our U.S. military, and obviously it's mostly the ground forces, but it's all the forces. They've had one job, just keep rotating. Come home, get new recruits, get the guys out who are getting out going to college, train them up, and go right back into the fight. Some of them have been on this thing for an awfully long time. And it's completely natural that during that time, institutions get the behavior they reward. We rewarded combat capability. We still reward that. Our retention rate is somewhere around 85% of those who want to stay in. The challenge is if we get smaller, we aren't going to keep sergeants in and have them doing private work. It's not right. If you can't give a person upward mobility, if you can't give them a job commensurate with their size, and that unit goes away, it's not fair to the American people, it's not fair to the individual, and it will eventually mess up the Marine Corps. So what the Commandant is trying to do is restore the garrison side of the discipline, which is critical, because I have never found a unit that could have DUIs and alcohol abuse and sexual harassment, but somehow have good discipline on control their fire support and everything else. You can't live a disciplined life and an undisciplined life. You live one or the other. And the Commandant is responsible for making certain that when he turned over the Marine Corps, it's in as good a shape as he got it. So I completely support what he's doing. I think that one of the challenges we have is in an age in America where being a victim is a good thing. You know, you get CNN makes you a hero and everything. I was trying to figure something out to become a victim, and I couldn't figure anything out because I laughed too much. You know, I'm no victim. I'm an American. I make choices. I'm a Marine. I make choices. So I think at that point, news media have started trying to pick out an individual, saying this individual shouldn't have been put out. Certainly that can happen sometimes, but it doesn't define the Marine Corps. So I think they're on the right track, and they'll be ready to fight next time too. But the percentage of combat veterans that will be in the Marine Corps 5 years from now will be higher than any time in our history. So that shows the retention will be there, and we can actually track this statistic. So rest well on this, okay? Yeah, okay.
Yes, General, my name is Will Hinckley. Served 87 to 91. U.S. Marine Corps. Really love this country, and I love the United States Marine Corps. My question pertains to experience I had. It's a touchy-feely subject. It's about hazing. While attached to 3rd Marine Division, serving with 7th Communications Battalion, I was deployed to Operation Team Spirit in 88 and 89, actually 89. And I was assaulted by a group of 6 of my fellow brother Marines. And at the time, that was something that the Marines don't rat out of the Marines. So the command structure was such that in a situation like this, the victim would become further victimized. And I know there's the recent signing of the military sexual assault bill last month, and I wondered what your opinion is, or what your feeling is, the direction the Marine Corps needs to take to ensure that men and women are in uniform are assaulted in this way.
Yeah, you know, it's really an interesting question because I joined the Marine Corps in '69, and I don't remember hazing. And then I'm told that a movie came out, something about Guantanamo Bay, and I don't know. I don't go to movies. I don't know what it is. What's the name? A Few Good Men. And suddenly we had this stuff going on. And it seemed to come up in the late 80s, 90s time frame. And you know what I learned as a young officer taught by NCOs, that it's real nice, Lieutenant, that you tell us what you want us to do and everything like that. But you have to understand that these are rambunctious, very physical young men. And make certain they know what you absolutely will not tolerate, because they need to know that too. And the Marine Corps, I'm not sure where this hazing idea came from, and somehow after boot camp, it seemed to me 12 weeks of orchestrated hazing the whole time. But once they got done with that piece of it, and they put an eagle globe of anchor on it, then it was a matter of getting on with your job and helping each other and the Marine Corps. So I don't know where it came from, but I'll tell you, the Marine Corps today will actually court-martial someone for that sort of conduct. We're not going to buy it. And for someone to say, well, I had to discipline them. That's the way you have to discipline somebody. There's something wrong with your force of personality already. Your unit has got a problem. So we don't tolerate this. It's not tolerated at all. And institutions, again, get the behavior they reward. We don't reward that. And so we're not going to have, and you know, that's why they give general court-martial authority, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, sir. I just want to say, I speak for a lot of my friends that are veterans, almost all of them unanimously would follow you anywhere, including myself. God bless you.
Well, be careful on that one.
Thank you very much for your talk and for visiting our campus. I'd like to get your opinion on a couple of processes that perhaps are undermining or threatening this tradition of separation or civilian control of the military. The two parallel processes I see are, over time, the increased militarization of the intelligence agencies, the CIA becoming a more of a militarized force and killing people. We also see today's events what could be seen as disdain for civilian control of their own agencies, with allegations that they're actually spying on the legislature. And so is that not perhaps something we need to be aware of and a threat to this separation of the agencies?
And you're talking about the allegation, the CIA spy, yeah.
On the Vice Banks Committee.
And if you go back, okay, I got the, but if you go back to the 1946 to 50 time frame when we're trying to reorganize the U.S. military for what is developing into the Cold War, they wanted to have a non-military intelligence agency. They call it the Central Intelligence. It's a civilian. It is not under the Department of Defense. It's completely separate and directly, as you know, to the President of the United States. So what's happened as far as the stuff with the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, I don't have any details on. But the director of CIA said it's absolutely not what they've done. And I think that it's going to be proven one way or another. So for him to come out and say that, I'd say at least until all the evidence is in, I wouldn't jump to a conclusion on it. The second point, as far as the militarization of the CIA, what's happened is the enemy has decided not to fight in mass tank formations, big naval fleets at sea. So the CIA has become a fight for intelligence. I'll be frank with you. I've never fought anyone easier to kill than the Taliban. All it is a fight for intelligence. Once you get it, they're very easy to dispatch. And you watch all the Afghan men and women go to the polls the other day to show that they also hold the Taliban in contempt. So it is a different kind of war. And in that war where intelligence is so important, then in some cases, because the CIA conducts covert activities, and they were set up to do this in the 1940s, this is not new, this is not a militarization of the CIA, then you may not want the U.S. military always doing the fighting. In other words, it may not be something that the U.S. military is best used to address. This is a decision by the president. So if the president chooses to do that, so far we've had a conservative president from Texas and a liberal constitutional lawyer president from Illinois who both chosen to do it. So you'd have to go down and say, go back to Einstein's point, if I had 60 minutes to save the world, how would I order my thoughts? And he said I'd spend the first 55 minutes defining the problem and I'd save the world in 5 minutes. I think you may want to define what is the problem that caused a very conservative president and a very liberal president to do exactly the same. Actually, the liberal president has increased the use of the CIA in this area. So I would go back and look at that, and therein I think you can get a better answer to your question. It would have to do with defining the problem. I don't think it has to do with militarizing the Civ Mill gap. Now, whether the CIA should be doing it, sincere people can line up on both sides of that issue, and I have no preference one way or another as long as we fight our enemies. That's the important thing, to keep them from getting through to Europe, keep them from getting through to Australia, to India, to Africa, to America. Best answer I can give you on that. Yeah, good questions, thanks.
Good afternoon, sir. Local John Forsberg, Battalion, both Marines. Right when I was getting out last year, they started to bring women into the artillery field.
Yeah.
You've been an infantry officer. How do you feel is the best way for them to go about achieving that kind of integration? Because it's going to happen at some point. How do they do it successfully?
Yeah, frankly, I don't know how you do it. The reason I say this is we have 10,000 years of human sexuality that we deal with every day on this campus, in our society, in our military. And we have never had the same standard, physical fitness standard for women, at least not in the Marine Corps or the Army. So I don't know how you would do that, although you could eventually find some women who could meet the standard. Generally, they'd be meeting the minimum standard. For those of you who serve in the infantry, you know if you make the minimum standard, you'll be mocked all day. And, people have a different standard in that line of work. So what we're talking about is a quantifiable standard. Some women perhaps make it, although right now the Commandant, who said 2 years ago women would start doing pull-ups, had to cancel that after 2 years because we would have flunked out over half the women in the Marine Corps could not do the bare minimum. So if you can't start with a strength there, then how do you then turn to the non-quantifiables? And the primitive atavistic behavior that is required of an infantryman in close quarters battle, close quarter killing, is not one that would be rewarded by having the affections of men and women, healthy young men and women in the same unit. These are unsolvable problems, and I'm amazed. I could walk around on Dartmouth campus where I've taught, Stanford campus, Berkeley, Texas A&M, and I can see specific behaviors that if they happen in the U.S. military would be considered sexual assault, and are happening right out on the campus. We're recruiting people from a society that objectifies women, Hollywood objectifies women, and yet we expect them to walk in at age 19 and be little saints. We are making it impossible for our sergeants, corporals, and lieutenants to maintain good order and discipline. So I think it's the silliest thing I ever heard of. But aside from that, I got nothing strong to
Thank you, sir. There's many of us here today, from Vietnam veterans to young veterans that are just coming out and coming back into the civilian world. And one agency that's been there for us has been the VA. The VA is in the process of being substantially overwhelmed just by sheer numbers. And it's going to be even more overwhelmed as these current conflicts come to some type of a close, but there's more to come. I'm concerned as the funding is becoming very, very challenged for the VA, and yet we're taxing it even more. What do you see happening on your level?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I always look at who's leading organizations, and I look very critically at them. I mean, I've removed leaders below me I didn't think were right. I know how to look at leaders and whether or not they can really handle what's going on. And General Shinseki, the former Chief of Staff of the Army, wounded himself in Vietnam. He's got a very big heel on his shoe because he's had part of his foot blown off. This is a man who understands what the VA is all about. Secondly, the Congress, if there's one area they have been very supportive of maintaining the funding for it, it's the Veterans Administration. So I think, and since we also have veterans here from Korea and World War II, by the way, I think that in many ways it's a better VA than we've ever had. But the potential for overwhelming it, I think, is very real. So they're going to have to continue to mature it. At the same time, they're going to have to encourage young people to join up, to not see themselves all as somehow dysfunctional with syndrome or with disorders. Come at it from a point of view of health. Because besides post-traumatic stress disorder, and this is one of the areas that is overwhelming right now, there's a thing that I've seen with many young Marines, not a real fight, I mean tough house-to-house fighting, that's post-traumatic growth. You actually grow stronger in your faith in God, in your commitment to your family, to your community. And those men who fought at the Battle of the Bulge and Iwo Jima in World War II, the ones who came out of Quezon or came out of Chosin Reservoir or Iwo Jima, they came home and raised healthy families. They became presidents of universities and ran corporations and had healthy communities. And we're starting to get to the point up in Canada, ladies and gentlemen, they show a tape of films of all their troops coming home from Afghanistan, and it's titled, "It's Okay to Be Okay." Is that not amazing? We have to say it's okay to come home and not be crazy. So I think we've also created, I was actually coached when I was leaving. The poor young guy had no idea what rank I was. And he asked, "What's your rank?" I said, "Well, I'm just in the infantry." He said, "Well, what is the rank there?" I said, "It's INF." So now when they call me up at a VA thing, they call, well, Inf Mattis. Yeah, I've never heard of that rank before. I said, "Yeah, it's very special." So they don't know what they actually coached me what to say. So when I got out, I could get more money for disability. I'm not disabled. Look how lucky I am. 2 arms, 2 legs. I mean, those of you who've been there know how lucky I am. And so we've got to be careful that we're not creating a sense that people are messed up and overwhelming the VA when the guys who really need help are being submerged in frankly, a sea of people who probably all they need is to be told, "You're fine, you'll get over the bad dreams, they eventually go away." One day you'll look around and say, "Hey, I hadn't any bad dreams, where's my old buddies?" You know, no big deal.
It's like at one point we made it too hard for them, you know, to be able to seek that help.
Well, I don't know.
We're making it too easy.
Yeah.
I don't know if
Yeah,
that's
if that
probably
might be a kind of the balance now. We're making it too hard for the people who really need it, too easy for people who are being rewarded with money who don't need it. You know, they didn't go through anything as bad as Iwo Jima. You know, so I don't have all the answers, but I'm now going through it myself and trying to be treated like a nobody and see how it works. Working okay. I mean, I just love life, you know, I didn't get deficit in, you know, that's good. Thank you.
Mike Winchester, Fox Company 223 and Bravo 15. My question today is about transitioning from military to civilian life.
Yeah.
First, I just also like to say thank you to all the Vietnam vets. When I came home from Iraq and Afghanistan, I've been treated very, very well. I know that a lot of the reason why is because the Vietnam vets were treated poorly and they ensured that our country wouldn't do it again. So I do think we owe them a debt of gratitude, and I'd just like to say thank you for that. Now, you spoke about the growing gap culturally. We have a lot of families that spend the time in it. It's an increasingly smaller portion of the society that does it. Yet employers come from all walks of life. I found since I've come out, there's been places where I've applied that wouldn't hire me. And in the place that did hire me, the only difference was family experience in the military. So my question for you is, what can I do now as a recent civilian to try and bridge that gap? Because I know we have this, there's the stigma, you know, PTSD. Every time a vet does something, they blame it on PTSD. They believe we're only in sexual harassment, things like this. People have a bad attitude. How can we bridge that gap when getting jobs? And once we actually have a good, solid employment, how would you advise turning our military experience into kind of a civilian application where we can lead people that aren't cut out of the same cloth?
Yeah, well, great question. The president has actually gotten corporate leaders to come in and sign on. They're going to have active programs to hire more veterans. I think the most important thing you can do is in your usual way of being at work early, sober, reliable, by giving 110%. You set an example and say, we want more of wherever that guy came from. So the personal example is very important. And as far as this other stuff about, well, PTSD or, you know, whatever the deficiency is, I just remind people that even Jesus of Nazareth had 1 out of 12 go to mud on him. You know what I mean? You know, so, okay, so what's
That's
wrong?
beautiful.
We're the good guys, we're not the perfect guys and gals in the U.S. military, okay? And I would just keep a little bit of a sense of humor, but what's interesting is I have had invitations from Microsoft, Goldman Sachs, Starbucks. They all want me to come and talk to their folks about how to hire veterans. Now that's a financial house in New York, that's a coffee shop all over the world out of Seattle, Microsoft out of Seattle. I think the Western United States is wide open. I'm living now in Silicon Valley. I live right on Sand Hill Road, and they are eager to hire every veteran they can get their hands on. They cannot get enough of them. And so I think the examples of what you all are setting or selling already, that I'm getting that kind of interest. Plus the president saying, I want the companies, corporations to do this, and all these big CEOs come in. I think that's just a positive statement. That sends a message down to their companies too.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. Over here.
Yeah, you have a lot of experience, obviously, evaluating leadership ability.
Yeah.
If you could boil your evaluation process down to one or two factors, what would you look for most in the people that you would allow to remain at a level of leadership and those who would change up?
You know, it's interesting, the question that you bring up, because I used to look like I commanded a 7,500-man regiment once. And I wondered why a platoon of 40 was even better than 200 in certain tactical problems. And it wasn't that the troops were any different. Napoleon said, you got problems in a regiment, you don't fire 5,000 guys, you fire one. You know what I mean? Command. And what the difference I found was that some men, some women, obviously as an infantry, I saw this in men, have the ability to convey that they really care about their troops. They're not soft guys. They're oftentimes physically the toughest guy there, or they're at least one of the toughest. They're mentally sharp. If they troops know that you care about them, they can take very direct words back, including some pretty harsh words, which you have to do sometimes when they are disappointing you. But the word that separates them, if I was to give you the word, I can fly on board a ship or go on board a ship, and in 15 minutes I can tell you if it's a happy crew or an unhappy crew. I can go into a combat outpost on the Pakistan border, and in 15 minutes I can tell you, is this a happy platoon or an unhappy one? And the difference, for example, my headquarters was composed of about 29 guys. They drove me everywhere. They were communicators, they were guards, aide-de-camp, sergeant major, that sort of thing. In 4 months of 29, 17 were killed or wounded around them. It was a very difficult time. Those of you who were there for Fallujah know the environment. And the gunnery sergeant who was in charge of all these guys was a rough guy. He was you had to rehearse every day, no matter how many times you've been out. He was a tough guy. But he also had a sense of humor in his rough way. Like I remember putting a young man on a stretcher, just scared to death, his daddy hurt. And the gunny just walked and said, boy, Smith, you sure messed up your health record this time, boy. You know, and the kid started smiling, the color started coming back to his cheeks. It was obviously the shock was wearing off, and he was coming back. So we were going to, and he did fine. The word I would use is not just trust and respect that you have to have from your subordinates, but affection. That's not the same as popularity. Affection, so that even as people are getting shot down around you, you keep moving. And some people can show that because they've already shown that their passion for excellence hasn't wiped out their compassion for the human beings who are putting their lives on the line. And it's a balancing act where you need the physically toughest people who are mentally, they know how to call for fire, get a medevac helicopter in quickly, but spiritually is where the affection comes in. Their spiritual development. And it's different for everybody. Everyone's got a different source of spiritual strength. You have to respect it. Does that answer your question? Yes. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Very well. Excuse me, sir, we have time for the gentleman
Very well. Hotel 25, 68, 69, Vietnam. Having listened to some of the other gentlemen that have asked questions, I'm going to ask one. But before that, I'll explain why I'm asking. I'm a life member of 5 military organizations. The Marine Corps League, Military Order of the Purple Heart, the VFW, the American Legion, and the DAV. And I would like every young Marine in this room, if you're living in Cache County or attending Utah State, talk to the gentleman in the red jacket, Gunny Brown. He's one of the officers in the detachment up here in Logan.
All right, a little recruiting going on here.
Just a little. I am in Weaver County, Box Elder County, Morgan, and Davis County. But I would like to ask the general if you don't think by joining these organizations, it's going to help veterans, because locally we can't do anything politically. Nationally, our headquarters from all of these organizations can, and we need the younger men to join, because you are the ones that are going to suffer more by losing your benefits. We're pretty much set in ours, the way it's going. But you're trying to take things away. Yes, they'll help the military, like the general said, Congress. But on the other hand, once you're out, we want to take yourself away from it. But don't you think, sir, by joining these military organizations, it would help?
I'm sure it would. I've not seen this eagerness to take things away. Now, there's some, the amount of money we are putting out right now is going to have to be reduced on all programs in the country. It simply has to happen because there is not the money there anymore. We cannot continue to borrow from China and Russia and enslave our children. Somewhere we're going to have to make priorities. And so I think there's an awfully strong support in the Congress anyway for the veterans. That doesn't mean there will be no reductions, but I think by and large, those organizations do keep the veterans' interest very high. So, yeah, I have no problem with all. Yes, sir.
Can you speak on the dilemma of the exceptionalism that many think are shown to soldiers for their actions that could be considered criminal, like the Deep Massacre, for example, actions like that some may think that are violating international law. If it was any other nation's soldiers, they would be prosecuted.
So your question is
how the U.S. Military can deal with what seems like exceptionalism in the prosecution of our soldiers. Like how would we deal with that to make other nations to comply with international law more?
Yeah. Well, one point is that the Americans have been very reluctant to turn our soldiers over to any international court. The reason is, under the U.S. Constitution, we say U.S. soldiers don't lose their constitutional rights. We also probably have a objectively evaluated record of holding our troops more accountable than any military in history. I was, as you may be aware, I was in charge of the investigation and the handling of the Haditha cases. And I was the one who dismissed certain charges on young Marines, because you cannot criminalize every mistake on the battlefield. To a person who has seconds to make a decision, they make the best decision they can. If they do something where they should not have done it, I don't care about their emotional state at the time, that's why we train them, and we will hold them accountable. I've put men in jail for years who thought that they didn't have to obey those rules. But, for example, when some British newsmen joined an Iraqi attack on a Marine tank unit and end up dead because they want to get good film footage, and a coroner's jury in another country said, we want these Marines charged, I said, no. That's what you get when you join the enemy. You get good film footage attacking a Marine tank unit. You're probably not going to collect on your 401k. Frankly, I'm not going to care more about their lives than you as a TV industry didn't care about them when you sent them over there with such silly guidance to do something like that. So it's a balancing act. You cannot criminalize every mistake, But at the same time, for example, I held out of 35,000 sailors and Marines that went through 1st Marine Division during my command of it, I convened 23 general court-martials. Every one of them, and this is before Abu Ghraib ever happened, was for abuse of enemy prisoners. Because I got in front of every, and some of you were there who were in those units, I got in front of every battalion and said, when they throw down their rifle, it's over. At that point, I don't care if they've been shooting at you, I don't care if you've lost your buddies, you take them prisoner and you treat them humanely. That's the way Americans do it. And where I found that violated, the sergeants took charge, they ran the charge sheet up, the lieutenant colonel sent it to me, and I said, that's not a insignificant crime and you're held accountable. So it's a balancing act, and we do have a very good legal system, no matter what some people in Congress are saying. F. Lee Daly, the finest defense counsel in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, wrote a book that says the defense never rests. He said where someone is innocent or guilty, he would rather defend them in a U.S. military court because they have more rights under a court, because they're more apt to be seen as kangaroo courts when there's generals over the top of them. So we do a very good job of this, that I don't think we're ready to surrender to international criminal courts, American citizens. That answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Yes, sir.
It took a lot of those to get up to this.
My name's John Cole, as a sergeant, 1st Marine Division. I have company with battalion, 5th Marine, 1st Marine Division. I want to give just a little bit of history. I've heard the Chosin mentioned several times today. I'm the president of the Utah chapter of the survivors of the Chosin. The Chosin is a place in North Korea where the 1st Marine Division was surrounded by, the number varies from 120,000 to 150,000 Chinese troops. And a very sad thing happened to our Corps commander, who was an Army General, 2-star general, come up and told at the Hag Room and talked to General Smith, who was the 1st Marine Division general. And he told him, have all the 5th, 7th, and 11th Marines up to be damned. We destroy the big equipment, every man for himself, and we fix them all at the sea. This was in November, December. The warmest temperature recorded was 50 below zero when the wind wasn't blowing. Snow was blowing. On our way out of there, General Smith and General Holman told me they had to do. General Smith was a very Christian gentleman. Got up in his face and he says, General, that's not the way Marines fight a war. He says, we're either coming out here all together as a fighting unit, or we're not coming out at all. General Holman had his news people with him. They flew up to South Korea. Next night, my wife saw on television where the 1st Marine Division had been annihilated by hordes of Chinese in North Korea. About 15 days later, the Navy evacuated the 1st Marine Division, all their equipment, the rocket people were there, and some Army personnel were there. The one main thing they hadn't planned on was 100,000 men, women, and children. North Korea, our enemy, says we want nothing more to do with communism. We want to go to South Korea where there's freedom. After they departed all the military personnel out of Vietnam, Navy went out on the high seas, commandeered 2 more ships, loaded all those people, standing room only, and took them to an island off of South Korea. During the time, all that trip was 79 miles back down to the sea. When our Navy corpsmen were actually working on Marines that had been wounded, they were helping some of those young North Korean women deliver babies. They also made sure there was a program on each one of those ships that left with all those civilians, because some of
I think there's a better way to end the talk than just reminding ourselves of the nobility of the U.S. fighting man, fighting woman, as shown right there. But thanks very much, and the question and answer was the best part, wasn't it? Really. Dean?
And we have a brief presentation by Sergeant Major Lopez, if you'd like to come up onto the stand for a moment. And then we have a small gift we'd also like to pass.
Needs the chest page.
On behalf of Utah Marines, Organization for Veteran Marines, based in Salt Lake City, we've put together a jacket for you from us. It's a token of our appreciation. Many of us have served under your command at one time or another. And when we heard you coming out this way, we figured we got to do something.
Well, I love Utah, and I'll certainly remember you all for this on a cold day. You do get a few up here, don't you? But thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen.
And we hope to turn you into an Aggie at some level. We have some Aggie paraphernalia in here as well. All of us.
Hey, thanks, everybody.